The wind dragged red dust across the Arizona hills, a restless whisper that carried the smell of iron and ash. Silas Kane had lived in those hills for more than a decade, and in all that time he had learned the rhythm of silence. He kept to his cabin, a shotgun propped by the door, his tools worn from years of carving out a life no one else wanted. Neighbors were miles away, and he preferred it that way. The world behind him was heavy with regrets he had buried deep, and solitude was the only thing that dulled the weight. But solitude broke the evening she stumbled into his clearing. She appeared between the twisted pines like a ghost torn from the earth. Barefoot, her skin streaked with dirt, her body wrapped in nothing more than a ragged scrap of cloth. She collapsed against the fence post, clutching the fabric to her chest, as if her life depended on it. Silas froze on the porch, every instinct warning him that something had followed her here. Her lips moved dry and cracked, shaping words that barely carried across the yard. "Please don't. That was all." Two words hoarse and broken. She shook as though even the touch of air against her skin was unbearable. Silas took a step closer, slow, careful. She winced but did not run. When the cloth slipped, he saw her back and his stomach knotted. Burns welt symbols carved into flesh like some cruel hand had tried to write a name in her pain. For a moment, the sight pulled him back to Tennessee, to the war, to the faces of those he could not save. He had walked away once, left someone behind in the fire. He had sworn never again. He stripped off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, the gesture slow, deliberate, like a vow made without words. Then he lifted her, easily carried her into the cabin, and set her down on the cot by the back wall. She curled into herself, holding his coat like it was stitched from safety. Silas did not question her. He did not ask who had done this or why she had fled. He only built a fire in the stove, though the night was not cold because the sound of it crackling gave the room a heartbeat. Outside, the world kept turning. Inside, silence stretched between them, but it was not empty. It was the silence of survival. Later, when she stirred, her eyes found his for only a breath, and in that flicker of connection he saw something fragile but unbroken, a spark buried under ashes. He nodded once, not pressing, and she turned her face away. The next morning her voice rasped a single word: water. He gave her a cup, steady hands offering without force. She drank slow and careful, then looked at him again, with eyes that said more than words could carry. "I'm still here." Silas did not know then how much that single word would change the days ahead. He only knew the storm had followed her, and the fight was no longer a question of if, but when. The second day passed beneath a sky the color of pale smoke, the kind that pressed down heavy, waiting to break. Silas kept himself busy mending the fence, sharpening tools, pretending that the sound of hammer and steel could drown out the weight inside the cabin. The girl sat by the fire most of the day, wrapped in his coat, her face half hidden. She had not told him her name, and he had not asked. Names could come later. Survival came first. By late afternoon, she stepped outside, bare feet touching the dirt, as if she wasn't sure the ground would hold her. Silas watched her from the porch, leaning on the axe handle. Her eyes were fixed on the trees, but her voice drifted toward him in fragments. "They kept me in a camp," she whispered. "Not on any map. Men with guns, men who wore wealth like armor. They worked us until we broke." Silas said nothing, waiting. She hugged the coat tighter and went on. "I tried to run once. They broke my nose. Second time they carved into me." Her words faltered, her eyes wet but burning. "Third time I didn't plan. I just ran. And somehow I lived long enough to find your hills." Silas's grip tightened on the axe handle, the wood creaking. He wanted to ask who they were, how many where the camp lay, but the way she trembled told him her story was already carved deep enough. He only said, "You're safe here. For now." The sun dipped behind the ridge, turning the sky into fire. Silas whittled down a broken chair leg on the porch while she sat nearby, staring off into the woods. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of people who understood something about pain. Then the sound came. Hoofbeats. Fast, hard, climbing the ridge road. Silas set the knife down his hand, reaching for the shotgun, leaning against the wall. Inside, he said, voice sharp but steady. She froze, then moved as if her body had learned long ago to obey the sound of danger. She slipped back into the cabin, eyes wide, breathing quick. A rider appeared in the clearing. Not a cowboy, not a rancher. He wore a fancy vest, his mustache oiled and slick, but the cruelty behind his eyes was older than his clothes. He drew his horse to a halt, smirking as he scanned the yard. Ellie rose. He called, his voice a knife in the quiet. You got one chance to come back quiet. The girl stiffened inside the doorway, her knuckles white around the frame. Silas stepped down from the porch, shotgun in hand. She's not going anywhere. The man's grin widened. Ain't up to you, old man. Silas cocked the shotgun, not aiming yet, just enough to let the sound carry across the clearing. This isn't your camp. This is my land. And she stays. The rider spat into the dirt, eyes glittering. For a long moment, silence burned between them, broken only by the restless snort of the horse. Then he tugged the reins, turning back toward the ridge. You made a mistake, he called over his shoulder. Next time I won't come alone. Dust rose behind him as he vanished into the trees. Silas stood still, shotgun resting heavy in his hands, staring at the empty road. He knew men like that never spoke idle threats. They would come back, and they would bring others. Inside, Ellie's voice broke the silence. You should have let him take me. Silas turned, his eyes dark and steady. Not while I'm still breathing. She shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. They'll kill you for me. He stepped closer, setting the shotgun against the wall. Better to die fighting than to live watching them carve another mark into someone who deserves better. Her breath caught her shoulders, shaking. For a long moment, neither spoke, only the sound of the fire filling the cabin. Then she whispered, Thank you. Silas nodded, once his voice low, certain. We're not done yet. The storm's just starting. And in the stillness of the hills, the night closed around them, heavy with the promise of blood to come. 3 days passed, each one stretched thin as wire, humming with the weight of what was coming. The hills were too quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against the chest until breathing felt heavy. Silas moved through the motions of his days, but he cut no wood set, no traps, did no hunting beyond what they needed to eat. Instead, he kept the shotgun close, cleaning it over and over, like a priest polishing his altar. Ellie watched him sometimes from the table, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee gone cold, her eyes distant but never empty. At night, she woke gasping, sweat soaking through the coat he had given her. Silas never touched her, never startled her awake. He just sat by the stove, feeding the fire, until the crackle softened the room and her breathing steadied. One night, when her trembling wouldn't stop, he spoke softly, his gaze fixed on the flames. I lost someone once, swore I wouldn't let it happen again. You ran here for a reason, and if I can help you keep running, I will. Her eyes found his, glistening in the half-light. She whispered, I don't want to run anymore. The morning of the 4th day dawned wrong. The air hung still, no birdsong, no insects humming in the grass. Ellie felt it too. She lingered near the window, her fingers pressed against the sill, her body tense. When the first distant hoofbeats rolled across the ridge, she whispered, They're here. Silas rose, the shotgun, already loaded, shells laid out on the table in a neat line. Stay close, he told her, and she nodded, clutching the rifle he had pressed into her hands 2 days earlier. She had protested at first, but he had said better to hold it and not need it than need it and not hold it. Now she clung to it like a lifeline. 3 riders emerged from the trees, their silhouettes jagged against the sinking sun. One of them was the same man from before, his vest gleaming, his smirk colder than iron. He reined in his horse at the edge of the yard and called out, Step aside, old man. You had your warning. Silas stepped onto the porch, shotgun at his side. You'll have to come take her, he said, his voice even like the calm before thunder. The second rider shifted in his saddle, his hand creeping toward his belt. Silas didn't wait. The shotgun boomed. The man cried out, tumbling from his horse blood, pouring from his leg into the dust. The other 2 froze, startled by the swiftness of it. Ellie gasped inside the doorway, her hands tightening around the rifle stock. The leader snarled, rage twisting his face. You'll pay for that, Kane. Before Silas could answer, another voice cut through the clearing, steady as stone. Think real hard about your next move. From the tree line stepped a figure, tall, broad, a rifle slung low and a badge glinting on his chest. Abram Hale, Silas's old war brother, now sheriff of the territory. He leveled his rifle at the riders, his eyes sharp as blades. This here's my jurisdiction. The girl stays. The wounded man groaned in the dirt. The leader cursed under his breath, but he saw the steel in Abram's eyes and the fire in Silas's stance. With a sharp tug on his reins, he spat into the dust. This isn't over. The three of them rode off, slow but certain, disappearing into the pines. Silence fell heavy after broken only by the distant cry of coyotes. Silas lowered his shotgun, his chest rising and falling in measured breaths. Ellie stepped out, her face pale, but her jaw set. She looked from Silas to Abram, her lips trembling before she spoke. They won't stop. Silas met her gaze, storm-gray eyes steady. Then neither will we. Abram clapped a hand on Silas's shoulder, his voice low. You've stirred up a hornet's nest. They'll be back and in numbers. Silas nodded, his grip tightening on the shotgun. Then we'll be ready. Ellie's hands shook as she lowered the rifle, but her eyes burned with something fiercer than fear. For the first time since she stumbled into his clearing, Silas saw not just a survivor, but a fighter standing before him. The night closed in around them, the cabin's firelight flickering against the walls, and the storm on the horizon promised blood yet to come. Abram stayed the night, his presence filling the cabin with a steadiness Ellie had not felt since she was a child, safe under her father's roof. He and Silas spoke little, but when they did, it was in the clipped language of men who had already bled together, who needed no explanations. Abram told them the riders would not risk another small skirmish. Next time they would come in force. Before dawn, he saddled his horse, promising to return with men from town if he could trust them. But don't count on it, he warned. Half the folks out there are too scared, the other half are already bought. Silas watched him ride into the mist, then turned back toward the cabin. Ellie stood in the doorway, pale in the weak morning light. He won't make it back in time, she said quietly. Silas didn't argue. He only nodded and began preparing. The next 2 days became a blur of work, every hour bent toward survival. Silas reinforced the shutters with heavy planks, hammered iron nails into the doorframe, and dug shallow trenches around the yard to slow horses if they tried to rush the cabin. Ellie followed him like a shadow, learning each task as if it were scripture. When he showed her how to reload the rifle, she practiced until her fingers bled. When he taught her to listen for the snap of a branch beyond the tree line, she sat in silence for long minutes, straining to separate the wind from danger. At night, when the work was done, they sat by the fire with their weapons close. Silas cleaned the shotgun in slow, steady strokes, the same rhythm every time. Ellie stitched torn cloth into crude bandages, her hands trembling but determined. Sometimes she asked about the war, about the scars that cut across his arm and back. He answered only in pieces, enough for her to understand that he carried ghosts heavier than bullets. She did not press further. One evening as the sky bled, crimson Silas caught her standing by the window, staring out toward the ridge where the riders had last vanished. They branded me so no one would forget, she said softly, fingers pressed against her own back through the fabric of his coat. But every mark feels like a chain still dragging me. Silas set down the shotgun, crossing the room with slow steps. Chains only hold if you keep carrying them, he said. Those scars don't name you. They damn the men who made them. Her eyes shimmered, but she did not cry. Instead, she asked, what if they come back with 2030? What chance do we have? He looked at her, then steady and unflinching. A man doesn't measure his chances. He measures his ground. And this ground is ours. The next day brought heat, the kind that thickened the air and turned every breath into labor. Silas worked shirtless in the yard, sweat running down his scarred back as he stacked barrels of water against the cabin wall. Ellie helped haul wood, her thin frame straining but refusing to give out. When she faltered, he pressed bread into her hand, telling her to eat. She shook her head at first, ashamed, but he held her gaze until she obeyed. That night, a storm gathered on the horizon, thunder rolling over the hills. Silas stood in the doorway, watching lightning split the sky. Ellie came to stand beside him, clutching the rifle she had kept near, even while she slept. Will it be tomorrow, she asked. He didn't answer right away. The stormlight painted his face in flashes, hard and lined with years of loss. Finally, he said, they'll come when they think fear has softened us. But fear doesn't soften steel. It tempers it. She stared at him, the weight of his words sinking deep. For the first time since she had stumbled into his clearing, she felt something stronger than terror stirring in her chest. Resolve. As rain began to fall in heavy sheets, they pulled the shutters closed and stoked the fire high. The cabin groaned under the storm's fury, but inside the two of them sat shoulder to shoulder, silent waiting. Neither spoke of what the next dawn might bring. Neither needed to, because both knew the storm outside was nothing compared to the one gathering in the dark beyond the ridge. The storm that had battered the hills broke by morning, leaving the earth wet and the air heavy with the smell of rain and pine. Silas woke before dawn, his body stiff, his mind sharper than the blade of the knife he kept on the table. Ellie stirred beside the dying fire, the rifle across her lap, even in sleep. She jolted awake when he touched her shoulder. "They'll come today," he said simply. Her throat worked, but she nodded, no argument left in her. The past days had burned that out of her. Instead, she rose, tied back her hair with a strip of cloth, and helped him check the defenses one last time. The shutters held firm, the barrels stood ready, the trenches gaped in the yard like scars in the mud. By mid-morning, silence pressed against the cabin like a hand over the mouth. No birds, no wind. Then came the first echo of hooves. One, then many. Ellie froze by the window. Silas loaded the shotgun with slow, practiced motions. "Stay low," he told her. The riders appeared from the ridge, more than before, at least a dozen. Their horses restless, their torches sputtering in the damp air. The leader was there, vest gleaming even under the gray sky, his grin cutting across the yard. He raised his hand, and the riders fanned out, circling the cabin like wolves scenting blood. Kane, his voice carried sharp as a whip. "Last chance. Send her out and maybe you walk away breathing." Silas stood in the doorway, shotgun in hand. "You'll get her over my grave." The man's grin widened. "So be it." He snapped his fingers. Gunfire shattered the silence. Bullets tore into the walls, splinters flying. Ellie ducked, heart hammering. Silas returned fire, the shotgun booming, smoke rolling through the doorway. One rider cried out, toppling from his horse into the mud. Chaos erupted, shouts, hooves pounding, guns barking. Torches flew through the air, thudding against the cabin walls. Flame licked at the wood hungry. Silas cursed, rushing to stomp one out while Ellie fired from the window, her shoulder jolting from the recoil. The shot grazed a rider enough to send him wheeling away. She gasped, the rifle heavy in her hands, but Silas's voice cut through the roar. "Good, keep breathing, keep firing." The leader spurred his horse closer, pistol raised. "Burn them out," he bellowed. Two riders charged the porch. Silas dropped one with a shot to the chest, but the other slammed against the door, cracking the frame. Ellie screamed, but instead of fleeing, she lunged with the knife Silas had pressed into her hand days before. She drove it through the gap in the door, felt it strike flesh, heard the man howl and stumble back. Silas met her eyes for a heartbeat. Pride flickered there, sharp as steel. The fight raged on. Smoke filled the cabin, the air thick with the stench of powder and fire. Silas's sleeve darkened with blood where a bullet had grazed him, but he didn't falter. Ellie tore strips from the bedding, pressing them to his arm between volleys. Outside, the yard burned with chaos, horses screaming, men shouting, flames threatening to climb higher. Then, just when it seemed the cabin might collapse under the storm, a new sound split the air. Rifles cracking from the ridge, men shouting. The bandits reeled as bullets tore into their ranks from behind. Silas stepped into the yard, smoke curling around him, and saw Abram Hale riding hard with a posse at his back. Rifles blazing. Dust and fire churned as the two groups collided. The leader's eyes blazed with fury. He locked on Ellie, raising his pistol. "She's mine!" Silas roared, swinging the shotgun. The two men fired at the same time. The leader's shot seared across Silas's ribs, spinning him back while his own blast knocked the man from the saddle. Ellie screamed, rushing to Silas as he staggered, blood soaking his shirt. The leader writhed in the mud, eyes, wide, life spilling out. His men broke, scattering into the trees under the posse's fire. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of dying flames and the groans of the wounded. Ellie knelt beside Silas, her hands pressing against his wound, her tears mixing with the rain. "Stay with me," she begged. "Please." He gritted his teeth, forcing a grim smile. "Takes more than one bullet to bury me." Abram dismounted, crouching beside them. His eyes scanned the wound. "Clean shot. He'll live." Ellie sagged in relief, clutching Silas's hand to her chest. Her breath came ragged, but in her eyes burned something fierce and unbroken. The cabin still stood, battered and scorched, but alive. So were they. And as the smoke drifted into the gray sky, Silas realized that for the first time in 12 years, he was not just fighting to survive. He was fighting for someone worth living for. The fire had smoldered out by dawn, leaving the yard a ruin of charred wood-churned mud and blood darkening in the dirt. Silas lay on the cot inside his shirt, stripped away bandages wound tight around his ribs. Every breath came with a wince, but his eyes stayed open, fixed on the beams above, as if watching the roof might keep it from collapsing. Ellie moved quietly around the cabin, washing wounds with boiled water, replacing cloths gone crimson. Her hands shook at first, but she forced them steady. Outside, the posse gathered the fallen and drove off the bandits' scattered horses. Abram came in once, his boots heavy on the floorboards. "You'll heal," he said gruffly, looking at Silas. "But they won't stop. Word will spread. Men who ran camps like that don't forgive. They hunt." Silas's gaze flicked toward Ellie, then back to Abram. "Let them hunt," he rasped. "This isn't just about her anymore." Abram studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "I'll keep watch on the trails. But remember, Cain, even mountains wear down." With that, he left the door shutting hard behind him. Ellie dipped a cloth in the basin, wrung it out, and pressed it gently against Silas's side. He hissed, his jaw tightening, but he did not push her hand away. She sat beside him, silent for a time, until the words burst from her. "You could have let them take me. It would have been easier." Silas turned his head, his storm-gray eyes finding hers. "And watch them carve you down to nothing. I'd sooner burn this cabin to the ground with me in it." Her breath caught her throat tight. "Why, you don't even know me." "Don't need to," he said. "I know men like them. I know what they do. And I know what it feels like to fail someone who needed me." Silence hung heavy. Ellie lowered her gaze, fingers gripping the edge of the cot. "Then maybe I'm here to remind you, you're not done yet." Days blurred together. Silas heeled slow, his steps stiff, his breaths shallow. Ellie kept the cabin running, feeding the fire, hauling water, even braving the woods with the rifle to snare rabbits. She startled at every crack of a branch, but each time she came back with something. Pride sharpened her eyes. Nights were harder. Sometimes Silas woke, gasping, the memory of the gunshot burning through his ribs. Sometimes Ellie woke screaming, clawing at her back, as if the marks there were being carved fresh. They never spoke of it directly, but in those dark hours they shared the same firelight, the same silence, and that was enough. One evening, as the sun painted the hills in dying gold, Ellie stepped out with a basket of wildflowers she had gathered. She set them on the window ledge, their colors bright against the soot-stained walls. Silas watched from his chair, his hand resting on his bandaged side. "Never thought flowers belonged in a place like this," he said quietly. "They do now," she answered, brushing dirt from her hands. He studied her for a long moment, then rose, wincing but steady. He picked up a broom unused for years and swept the porch clean. Ellie stood in the doorway, surprise softening into a smile. The cabin began to change little by little. The scars remained on the wood on their skin, but so did signs of life. She cooked with what they had. He mended fences when his strength allowed. They spoke more small words at first, then stories, his of battles lost, hers of dreams stolen. But beneath it all lay the truth neither dared voice. This peace was fragile, a glass thread stretched over fire. The men who had marked Ellie, the men who had built camps on suffering, were still out there. And sooner or later the hills would shake with hoofbeats again. That night, as they sat over stew and bitter coffee, Ellie lifted her eyes from the fire. "What if we left, found somewhere they couldn't follow?" Silas shook his head slowly. "Running doesn't end it. Only facing it does." She studied him, her hands curling around the cup. "Then we face it. Together." The words hung in the air, a vow sharper than steel, stronger than blood. Silas nodded once, his gaze steady. Together. Outside, the coyotes sang to the moon, and for the first time their voices sounded less like omens and more like a promise. Dawn broke red across the ridge, a thin line of fire that bled into the pale sky. Silas had just stepped onto the porch, shotgun leaning against the rail, when the sound of hooves carried up the trail. Ellie hurried from the cabin, rifle slung awkwardly across her back, her braid loose from sleep. Both froze until the rider came into view. Abram, his horse foamed at the bit, lather shining down its neck. Abram dismounted before the animal had fully stopped, his face carved with exhaustion and urgency. "They're coming," he said without preamble, his voice rough as gravel. "Not just a handful this time. They've gathered near 24 men, maybe more, armed, mounted, and angry. The camp bosses don't like losing what they own. Ellie paled her fingers, nodding in the hem of Silas's coat. 24, she whispered. Silas didn't flinch. How long? A day, maybe less, Abram answered. They've been seen moving east, following the ridgeline. I came ahead to warn you. I'll bring what men I can, but truth is, he glanced between them, his jaw tight. There may not be enough willing to stand against them. Silas's gaze shifted toward the hills, gray eyes hard as stone. Then we make the ground do the fighting for us. The rest of the morning burned with frantic work. Silas and Abram cut logs and drove them into the earth building, crude barricades around the cabin's perimeter. Ellie hauled water until her arms shook, filled every basin, bucket, and barrel they could find. They scattered oil-soaked rags near the trenches, weapons of last resort if torches came again. Abram showed Ellie how to steady her aim, his big hands guiding hers. Don't think about hitting a man, he told her. Think about protecting what's behind you. She swallowed hard, nodding her knuckles white around the rifle stock. Silas worked without pause despite the ache in his ribs. Sweat streaked his face, soaking through his shirt, but he did not slow. Every nail driven, every log lifted was another wall between Ellie and the hell chasing her. When the sun dipped, they gathered inside. The air was thick with smoke from the fire. The table crowded with shells, knives, strips of cloth ready for bandages. Silence stretched between them until Ellie spoke. I'm not afraid to fight, she said, her voice low but steady. But I'm afraid of losing this, of losing what we've built. Silas's head lifted, his storm gray eyes softening. What we've built is more than walls and wood. It's in you, and they can't take that unless you let them. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. Then promise me we'll stand, no matter what. He closed his hand over hers, rough palm, warm and unyielding. We'll stand. The night stretched long, broken by distant echoes. An owl's cry, the restless shuffle of Abram's horse in the yard. Ellie dozed fitfully in a chair, the rifle across her lap, while Silas sat awake staring into the fire, his mind running through every path, every angle of the coming storm. Before dawn, Abram touched his shoulder. They'll be here soon. The scouts saw fires on the ridge. They're making ready. Silas rose stiff but steady. He strapped on his belt, checked the shotgun, nodded to Ellie as she blinked herself awake. Her eyes held fear. Yes, but something else too. Steel. As the first light broke over the hills, the three of them stepped onto the porch. The world was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before thunder. Ellie drew a sharp breath, and Silas laid a hand on her shoulder. Whatever happens, he said, his voice low, and even we end it here. From the ridge the sound came. Hooves, many rolling like a drumbeat of war. Figures crested the hill, dark against the rising sun. Torches flared. Rifles gleamed. Ellie lifted her rifle. Abram leveled his. Silas chambered around, his jaw set. The storm had come to their door, and they were ready to meet it. The ridge boiled with riders, their shouts echoing through the morning air, a sound like wolves driven mad with hunger. Dust rose in choking clouds as 24 men thundered down the slope, torches flaring, rifles bristling. Silas stood at the barricade with his shotgun braced across the top rail, every line of his body taut as iron. Beside him, Abram raised his rifle, calm and steady as if the battlefield were his church. Behind them, inside the cabin window, Ellie knelt with her rifle, her eyes wide but unflinching. The first wave came, hard, men firing wild as they galloped. Bullets split the air, thudding into the barricade, ripping through the boards. Silas fired once, the blast tearing a rider from his saddle in a spray of dust and blood. Abram's shot dropped another, his rifle cracking like thunder. The rest pulled back, regrouping, circling to flank. They'll try to burn us out again, Abram warned, reloading without looking away. Silas nodded, voice low. Then we burn them first. He struck flint to the rags they had laid in the trenches. Fire roared up, hungry and bright, a wall of flame, curling against the charge. Horses screamed, rearing back riders, cursing as the flames drove them wide. Ellie fired through the window, her shot grazing one man's shoulder, sending him spinning from his saddle. Her breath came fast, her hands trembling, but she worked the bolt and fired again, this time steady. The bandits rallied, half circling toward the barn, half pressing the barricade. One man hurled a torch that caught against the roof shingles. Ellie screamed, but Silas grabbed a pail and doused it before the flame could spread. Smoke stung his eyes, but he did not falter. Then the leader appeared, the man in the vest scarred now from the shotgun blast Silas had given him days earlier. Rage twisted his face. "Tear it down," he bellowed. Three riders surged forward at once, pistols blazing. Silas fired point blank, the recoil jarring through his wounded ribs, but he did not stop. Abram dropped another with a clean shot to the chest. The third leapt from his saddle, crashing into the barricade, clawing for purchase. Ellie's scream cut the air, and then her rifle barked. The man fell back, his eyes wide with shock, blood spreading across his shirt. The yard churned with chaos, mud mixing with blood smoke curling like snakes. Silas felt the weight of every breath, every trigger. Pull, but he kept firing, kept standing. Abram fought beside him, relentless, a wall of iron. Ellie reloaded again and again, her face streaked with soot and tears, but her eyes fierce. Then the leader charged. He rode straight through the smoke pistol, drawn his horse foaming at the mouth. "You're dead, Kane," he roared. Silas leveled the shotgun, but the weapon clicked empty. Before he could reload, the rider was on him, leaping from the saddle, slamming into him with the force of a falling tree. They crashed to the ground, fists in fury tangling in the dirt. Silas's ribs screamed pain, blinding, but he clung to the man's wrist, forcing the pistol away. The leader snarled, driving a knee into Silas's side. "She's mine. Always was." "Not while I breathe," Silas growled, twisting with every ounce of strength left. The pistol fired the shot, going wide, ringing against the barricade. Abram moved to help, but two riders pinned him down with gunfire, forcing him to cover Ellie. Ellie's heart hammered as she watched the struggle, fear clawing at her throat. But then she remembered Silas's words. "Don't think about hitting a man. Think about protecting what's behind you." Her hands steadied. She lifted the rifle, sighted down the barrel, and fired. The bullet struck the leader in the shoulder, spinning him off Silas. Silas surged up, seizing the shotgun, ramming the stock into the man's jaw. Bone cracked. The leader collapsed in the mud, groaning, blood bubbling from his mouth. The remaining bandits, seeing their leader fall, broke. Fear swept through them faster than fire. They wheeled their horses, fleeing up the ridge, curses trailing behind. Abram fired a final shot, sending one rider tumbling. Then silence crashed down, heavy and absolute, broken only by the ragged breaths of the living. Ellie stumbled from the cabin, dropping the rifle, running to Silas. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she touched his face. "You're alive," she whispered, her voice breaking. Silas coughed, grimacing through the pain, but his eyes found hers steady, even in exhaustion. "Because of you." Abram lowered his rifle, surveying the carnage. "They won't come back," he said. "Not after this. Not with their leader broken." The three of them stood in the smoking yard. The barricades splintered, the ground littered with the dead. Ellie pressed her forehead to Silas's shoulder, her tears soaking through his torn shirt. "It's over," she whispered, as if saying, "It might make it true." Silas wrapped an arm around her, holding her close despite the pain. "No," he said softly. "It's beginning." And as the sun rose fully over the hills, casting gold across the battered cabin and the scorched earth, they stood together, three souls bound not by blood, but by battle, by fire, by the choice to stand when running would have been easier. The West would remember men like Silas Kane, lawmen like Abram Hale, women like Ellie Rose, not as survivors, not as victims, but as the ones who refused to break. The hills lay quiet again, the kind of quiet that comes not from peace but from exhaustion. Smoke still drifted thin from the barricades, mingling with the morning mist, but the echoes of gunfire had faded into memory. Silas stood on the porch, his ribs bound tight, his body aching from the fight. Yet there was something different in his eyes now. Not just the hardness of a man who had endured, but the faint glimmer of someone who had found a reason to keep enduring. Ellie moved through the yard, gathering what could be salvaged. Her hands, once shaking at every shadow, now worked with steady purpose. She pulled arrows from the ground, collected unspent shells, and stacked broken boards that could be repurposed. Dirt streaked her face. Soot darkened her hair, but her back was straight, her movements sure. When she glanced at Silas, her mouth curved into the smallest smile, fragile but real. Abram came out from the tree line, his hat low, his rifle slung across his back. He had spent the last hours tracking the trail of the survivors, ensuring they did not linger. His boots crunched against the gravel as he approached, his expression grim but resolved. "They're gone," he said. "What's left of them won't dare come back here. Not with their leader broken and their pride burned in the dirt." Silas nodded. "They'll find some other place to haunt. They always do." Abram's gaze lingered on Ellie, then back to Silas. "You've given her a chance. That's more than most men would risk." Silas's voice was quiet but firm. "It wasn't just me. She fought too." Ellie flushed, lowering her eyes. "I only did what I had to." Abram studied her for a long moment, then tipped his hat. "What you had to was more than many ever could. Don't forget that." The three of them stood in silence for a while, the weight of what had passed pressing down like the heat of the sun. Finally, Abram pulled the reins of his horse from where it was tied to the fence. "I'll ride back to town. There'll be questions, whispers, maybe even trouble, but I'll keep the law pointed in the right direction." He set a hand on Silas's shoulder, the grip firm. "If you need me, send word. I'll come." Silas clasped his arm, the old bond between them stronger now than it had been in years. "You've done more than enough." Abram shook his head. "No such thing." He swung into the saddle, turned the horse toward the ridge, and paused. "Take care of each other. That's the only way any of us survive out here." With that, he rode off, his figure shrinking against the horizon until the dust swallowed him whole. The yard felt emptier without him, but also quieter, calmer. Ellie sat on the porch steps, her knees drawn up, staring at the line of trees where danger had once poured. Silas lowered himself beside her with a grunt, his hand resting lightly on the shotgun across his lap. "He's right," Ellie said after a while. "We only made it through because we stood together." Silas nodded. "And we'll keep standing." She turned her face toward him, her eyes searching. "What happens now?" He looked out across the hills, the scorched earth, the broken fence, the cabin scarred but still standing. "We rebuild, not just the wood and nails. Us." Her lips parted, her breath catching. For so long she had lived with nothing but chains and fear. Now the idea of rebuilding, of living, felt like a foreign gift pressed into her palms. She swallowed hard, then leaned her shoulder against his. "Then we rebuild." They sat together as the sun climbed higher, painting the hills in gold. Silas felt the ache in his ribs, the sting of wounds yet to heal. But beneath it all was something fierce and steady. A reason. In the days that followed, the work began. Ellie mended the roof, her laughter surprising herself when Silas cursed the hammer and nearly dropped it on his foot. Silas cut new boards for the fence, his strength returning slowly but surely. Together they planted a small garden behind the cabin, rows of green pushing through the soil like proof that life always finds a way. At night when the coyotes sang, they no longer sounded like omens. They sounded like a hymn to survival. Ellie slept deeper, her nightmares easing. Silas no longer sat awake with ghosts pressing at his chest. Instead, he listened to her, breathing steady and soft, and found rest in it. The scars remained on their bodies on the land, but scars Silas knew were only proof that you had lived through fire and still stood. Weeks later, as autumn painted the hills in red and gold, Ellie set a basket of wildflowers on the porch rail. She looked at Silas, her smile quiet but certain. "See, even here beauty grows." He touched her hand, rough and calloused, holding it gently. "Especially here," he said. And as the wind carried the scent of pine and smoke, the cabin stood not as a ruin, but as a beginning. A place where two broken souls had chosen not to run, not to hide, but to face the storm and build something worth keeping. In the West, stories rarely ended. They bent, they scarred, they endured. This was theirs.